Question 1. The performance metrics show a significant increase in false positive incidents flagged by the Symantec Data Loss Prevention (DLP) system over the past quarter. Which of the following administrative actions is the most appropriate first step to address this issue? Option A. Disable the detection methods within the most problematic policies that are contributing to the false positive rate, prioritizing reduction of alert volume. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive review of the policies generating the highest volume of false positives, analyzing their detection methods, associated data types, and business context to identify tuning opportunities. Option C. Escalate the issue to the Symantec vendor, requesting a system-wide patch or update to resolve the perceived performance degradation. Option D. Immediately increase the alert severity threshold for all DLP policies to reduce the number of notifications, requiring analyst review. Correct answer is B. Conduct a comprehensive review of the policies generating the highest volume of false positives, analyzing their detection methods, associated data types, and business context to identify tuning opportunities. Explanation. The performance metrics show a significant increase in false positive incidents flagged by the Symantec Data Loss Prevention (DLP) system over the past quarter. This scenario is professionally challenging because it directly impacts operational efficiency, user productivity, and the credibility of the DLP program. A high rate of false positives can lead to alert fatigue among security analysts, potentially causing them to miss genuine incidents, and can also result in unnecessary investigations and disruptions for legitimate business activities. Balancing effective data protection with minimal business impact is a core responsibility of a DLP administrator. The correct approach involves a systematic data-driven investigation into the root causes of the increased false positives. This includes analyzing the specific policies triggering the alerts, reviewing the data sources being monitored, and assessing the accuracy of the detection methods, e.g., keywords, regular expressions, exact data matching, fingerprinting. It also necessitates engaging with business units to understand their data handling practices and to refine policies collaboratively. This approach represents best professional practice because it adheres to the principles of effective risk management and operational excellence. By proactively identifying and rectifying the causes of false positives, the DLP program becomes more accurate, efficient, and trusted, thereby better fulfilling its mandate to protect sensitive data without unduly hindering business operations. This aligns with the general principles of responsible data governance and security program management, which emphasize continuous improvement and alignment with business needs. An incorrect approach would be to simply increase the alert threshold for all policies without understanding the underlying issues. This is professionally unacceptable because it directly undermines the purpose of the DLP system by reducing its sensitivity to actual data loss events. It represents a failure to perform due diligence in investigating the performance degradation and a reactive, rather than proactive, approach to security. This could lead to missed incidents, violating the organization's duty to protect sensitive information, and potentially leading to regulatory noncompliance if specific data privacy laws are breached. Another incorrect approach would be to disable specific detection methods or policies that are generating the most false positives without a thorough analysis of their necessity and the types of data they are intended to protect. This is professionally unacceptable as it creates blind spots in the DLP coverage. It demonstrates a lack of understanding of the data at risk and the potential consequences of disabling these controls. This could result in a failure to comply with data protection regulations that mandate specific controls for certain types of sensitive data. A third incorrect approach would be to blame the DLP system's technology without investigating configuration or environmental factors. This is professionally unacceptable because it abdicates responsibility for system administration and optimization. DLP systems are tools, and their effectiveness is heavily dependent on proper configuration, tuning, and integration with the organization's IT environment. Blaming the technology without a comprehensive review of these aspects is a failure to apply professional expertise and a missed opportunity for system improvement. The professional reasoning process for this situation should involve a structured problem-solving methodology. First, clearly define the problem, an increase in false positive DLP incidents. Second, gather data, analyze alert logs, policy configurations, and incident reports. Third, hypothesize causes, Consider policy tuning, data source changes, or new data types. Fourth, test hypotheses. Conduct targeted investigation, policy adjustments, and pilot testing. Fifth, implement solutions. Deploy refined policies or configurations. Sixth, monitor and iterate. Continuously track performance metrics and make further adjustments as needed. This iterative, data-driven approach ensures that solutions are effective, sustainable, and aligned with both security objectives and business requirements. Question 2. The monitoring system demonstrates a high volume of alerts related to internal email communications. To address this, which of the following administrative approaches best balances the organization's need to prevent data loss with its obligations to protect employee privacy under relevant U.S. data protection regulations? Option A. Focus DLP efforts exclusively on external email communications and web traffic, assuming internal communications are inherently less risky and less subject to regulatory scrutiny. Option B. Conduct a targeted risk assessment to identify specific types of sensitive data and communication patterns that pose the greatest risk of unauthorized disclosure, and configure DLP policies to monitor only those specific scenarios. Option C. Disable all monitoring of internal email communications to eliminate any potential privacy concerns, relying solely on user training for data protection. Option D. Implement a policy to broadly enable monitoring of all internal email content and attachments, categorizing all detected sensitive data as high risk, to ensure no potential data exfiltration is missed. The correct answer is D. Implement a policy to broadly enable monitoring of all internal email content and attachments, categorizing all detected sensitive data as high risk, to ensure no potential data exfiltration is missed. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the organization's need for security and compliance with the privacy rights of individuals whose data is being monitored. Symantec Data Loss Prevention (DLP) system, while a powerful tool for preventing data breaches, can inadvertently capture sensitive personal information. Administrators must navigate the complexities of data protection regulations to ensure that monitoring activities are both effective and lawful. The Symantec DLP-15 exam focuses on the practical application of this technology within a defined regulatory environment, demanding a nuanced understanding of how to configure and manage the system without violating legal or ethical standards. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it aligns with the principles of data minimization and purpose limitation, which are fundamental to many data protection frameworks, including those likely relevant to a U.S.-based administration context for Symantec DLP. By focusing monitoring on specific, identified risks and limiting the scope of data captured to what is strictly necessary for those risks, an administrator upholds the principle of proportionality. This ensures that the DLP system is used as a targeted tool for risk mitigation rather than a broad surveillance mechanism, thereby respecting individual privacy and reducing the potential for overcollection of sensitive data. This approach is also more efficient and less prone to generating false positives, leading to better operational outcomes. An incorrect approach that involves broadly enabling monitoring of all communication channels and content types without a specific, documented risk assessment is professionally unacceptable. This would likely violate principles of data minimization and necessity, as it captures far more data than is required to address specific DLP concerns. Such a broad approach increases the risk of unauthorized access to sensitive personal information and could lead to significant regulatory penalties under data protection laws that mandate purpose limitation and proportionality. Furthermore, it can create an environment of distrust and negatively impact employee morale. Another incorrect approach, which is to disable all monitoring of internal communications to avoid any potential privacy concerns, is also professionally unsound. While it prioritizes privacy, it fails to adequately protect the organization from insider threats or accidental data leaks, which are significant risks that DLP systems are designed to mitigate. This abdication of responsibility for data protection can expose the organization to severe financial and reputational damage if a data breach occurs, and may also be in violation of regulatory requirements that mandate reasonable security measures. Finally, an approach that involves relying solely on user education without implementing technical controls like DLP is insufficient. While user education is a crucial component of a comprehensive data security strategy, it is not a substitute for technical safeguards. Regulations often require a layered security approach, and failing to implement appropriate technical controls, such as DLP, to prevent data loss would be a failure to meet due diligence standards and could result in regulatory noncompliance. The professional reasoning process for making such decisions should involve a thorough understanding of the organization's data assets, the specific regulatory requirements applicable to those assets, and the capabilities and limitations of the DLP system. It requires a risk-based approach, where monitoring efforts are prioritized based on the likelihood and impact of potential data loss events. Regular review and auditing of DLP policies and configurations are essential to ensure ongoing compliance and effectiveness. Question 3. Assessment of a Symantec data loss prevention 15 administrator's response to a high-severity alert indicating potential exfiltration of customer personally identifiable information, PI, via email. The alert was triggered by a policy designed to detect specific PII patterns. The administrator observes that the email was sent to an internal distribution list containing over 500 employees, and the content appears to be a legitimate internal HR communication regarding a benefits update, albeit containing employee ID and names. The administrator needs to decide on the immediate course of action. Option A. Immediately disable the PII detection policy to prevent further alerts and allow internal communications to proceed without interruption. Option B. Review the specific PII detection rules within the triggered policy, examine the full email content and headers for context, and assess the risk of actual data exfiltration versus a legitimate internal communication that triggered the rule. Option C. Ignore the alert and assume it is a false positive, as the email was sent internally and appears to be a standard HR communication. Option D. Immediately escalate the incident for disciplinary action against the sender, without further investigation. The correct answer is B. Review the specific PII detection rules within the triggered policy, examine the full email content and headers for context, and assess the risk of actual data exfiltration versus a legitimate internal communication that triggered the rule. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in data loss prevention, DLP, administration, balancing proactive threat detection with the potential for overblocking legitimate business communications. The administrator must interpret the nuances of a specific policy, understand the implications of its configuration, and consider the impact on user productivity and business operations. The professional challenge lies in making an informed decision that upholds security mandates without unduly hindering essential communication, all within the defined regulatory and operational context of Symantec Data Loss Prevention 15. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the DLP policy's specific conditions, the incident's context, and the potential for false positives. This includes examining the exact keywords, regular expressions, or content matching rules that triggered the alert. Understanding the policy's intent, whether it's to prevent exfiltration of sensitive intellectual property, PI, or other regulated data, is crucial. By analyzing the incident data against the policy's granular settings and considering the sender, recipient, and content, the administrator can determine if the communication genuinely violates the policy or if it's a benign misclassification. This methodical approach ensures that remediation actions are targeted, effective, and proportionate, aligning with the principle of least privilege and minimizing disruption. This aligns with best practices in DLP administration, which emphasize accurate policy tuning and incident investigation to maintain both security and operational efficiency. Incorrect approaches analysis. Disabling the policy entirely without investigation is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It bypasses the intended security controls designed to protect sensitive data, potentially exposing the organization to data breaches and non-compliance with data protection regulations. This action demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to uphold the administrator's responsibility to maintain the integrity of the DLP system. Ignoring the alert and assuming it's a false positive without any form of review is also professionally unacceptable. This approach neglects the potential for a genuine security incident. It fails to acknowledge the risk associated with data exfiltration or mishandling, which could lead to severe legal, financial, and reputational damage. This demonstrates a disregard for the organization's security posture and regulatory obligations. Immediately escalating the incident for disciplinary action without a proper investigation is premature and can lead to unfair consequences for employees. It bypasses the crucial step of verifying whether a policy violation actually occurred. This can erode employee trust and create a hostile work environment, while also failing to address the root cause of the alert, which might be a policy misconfiguration rather than malicious intent. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach DLP alerts with a structured investigative process. This begins with understanding the alert's origin and the specific policy that triggered it. Next, gather all relevant context surrounding the incident, including user, recipient, content, and timestamps. Compare this information against the policy's defined rules and thresholds. Based on this analysis, determine if a genuine violation has occurred. If a violation is confirmed, follow established incident response procedures. If the alert appears to be a false positive, document the findings and initiate a process to tune the policy to reduce future misclassifications. This systematic approach ensures accountability, accuracy, and continuous improvement of the DLP program. Question 4. Comparative studies suggest that organizations often struggle to balance comprehensive data protection with employee privacy rights. When administering Symantec Data Loss Prevention 15, an administrator is tasked with configuring policies to prevent the unauthorized exfiltration of sensitive data. Considering the regulatory framework for data protection, which of the following approaches best aligns with both compliance and ethical data handling practices? Option A. Implement broad monitoring of all employee communications and file transfers, flagging any content that could potentially be considered sensitive, regardless of specific regulatory definitions. Option B. Focus solely on blocking outbound traffic for all file types, assuming that any data leaving the organization poses a risk. Without specific content inspection, Option C. Configure DLP policies to specifically detect and prevent the unauthorized transfer of data classified as personally identifiable information, PI, financial records, and intellectual property, based on established organizational data classification standards and regulatory requirements. Option D. Deploy DLP policies that capture and log all employee keystrokes and screen activity, providing a complete audit trail of all user actions for security review. The correct answer is A. Implement broad monitoring of all employee communications and file transfers, flagging any content that could potentially be considered sensitive, regardless of specific regulatory definitions. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in data loss prevention, DLP, administration, balancing the need for comprehensive monitoring with the privacy rights of employees and the legal obligations of the organization. The professional challenge lies in interpreting and applying the specific regulatory framework governing data protection within the context of Symantec Data Loss Prevention 15 capabilities. The administrator must ensure that the DLP policies are not overly intrusive, thereby violating privacy laws, while still effectively preventing the unauthorized disclosure of sensitive information. This requires a nuanced understanding of what constitutes sensitive data under the relevant regulations and how DLP can be configured to detect and prevent its exfiltration without creating a surveillance state. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it aligns directly with the principles of data minimization and purpose limitation, which are foundational to many data protection regulations. By focusing on detecting and preventing the exfiltration of specific categories of sensitive data, such as PII or intellectual property, the DLP system is being used for its intended purpose and in a manner that respects employee privacy. This approach is justifiable under regulations that permit the monitoring of employee activities when necessary for legitimate business purposes, provided that such monitoring is proportionate and clearly communicated. The Symantec DLP 15 platform is designed to facilitate this by allowing granular policy creation based on data types and content. An incorrect approach that involves broadly monitoring all employee communications and activities without a specific, justifiable purpose would likely violate data privacy laws. Such a broad approach could be deemed disproportionate and an invasion of privacy, failing to adhere to the principle of necessity. For instance, if the organization's regulatory obligations do not mandate the monitoring of all internal email content for non-sensitive information, then implementing a policy to do so would be a regulatory failure. Similarly, an approach that fails to adequately anonymize or pseudonymize data where possible, or that retains logs for longer than necessary, would also fall short of regulatory requirements for data retention and processing. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the applicable regulatory framework, a clear definition of what constitutes sensitive data for the organization, and a risk-based assessment of DLP policy implementation. Administrators should consult with legal and compliance teams to ensure that DLP configurations are compliant. They should also prioritize policies that address the highest risks and have a clear business justification, while continuously reviewing and refining policies to ensure they remain effective and compliant with evolving regulations and organizational needs. Question 5. The risk matrix shows a high likelihood of unauthorized disclosure of protected health information, (PHI), and non-public personal information, (NPI), due to employee negligence. As the Symantec Data Loss Prevention 15 administrator, which of the following actions best aligns with U.S. regulatory frameworks like HIPAA and GLBA for mitigating this risk? Option A. Configure Symantec DLP to block all outbound email traffic containing any form of personal identifier, regardless of context. Option B. Implement and tune specific detection rules within Symantec DLP to identify and flag PHI and NPI, with policies to block or encrypt such disclosures. Option C. Focus DLP efforts on detecting and preventing the exfiltration of financial data only, as this is the most common type of data breach. Option D. Disable DLP monitoring for outbound email to reduce system load and avoid potential false positives impacting user productivity. The correct answer is A. Configure Symantec DLP to block all outbound email traffic containing any form of personal identifier, regardless of context. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the technical capabilities of Symantec DLP with the specific regulatory requirements of the U.S., particularly concerning the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA, and the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, GLBA. The administrator must ensure that the DLP solution is configured to detect and prevent the unauthorized disclosure of protected health information, (PHI), and non-public personal information, (NPI), without creating undue operational burdens or false positives that could hinder legitimate business processes. The core challenge lies in accurately identifying sensitive data types and applying appropriate policies that align with legal mandates. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the regulatory obligations under HIPAA and GLBA by focusing on the detection and prevention of specific types of sensitive data. Implementing predefined or custom detection rules for PHI and NPI, coupled with appropriate response actions like blocking or encrypting, ensures compliance with the spirit and letter of these laws. This proactive stance minimizes the risk of data breaches and the associated penalties, while also demonstrating due diligence in protecting sensitive information. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on general data exfiltration without specific regard to PHI or NPI would be a regulatory failure. HIPAA and GLBA have explicit requirements for the protection of these specific data types. Ignoring them means the DLP solution is not adequately configured to meet legal obligations, leaving the organization vulnerable to significant fines and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes blocking all outbound traffic containing any form of personal information without granular policy tuning would lead to operational disruption and is not a proportionate response to the regulatory requirements. It fails to distinguish between sensitive regulated data and less critical personal information, thus not representing a targeted and effective compliance strategy. Professionals should use a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of applicable regulations, HIPAA, GLBA. This should be followed by an assessment of the organization's data landscape to identify where PHI and NPI reside. Next, the technical capabilities of the DLP solution should be mapped against these data types and regulatory requirements to configure detection rules and response actions. Regular testing, auditing, and refinement of policies are crucial to ensure ongoing effectiveness and compliance. Question 6. To address the challenge of implementing Symantec Data Loss Prevention 15 in a U.S.-based organization, which approach to policy configuration best balances regulatory compliance with employee privacy expectations. Option A. Implement DLP policies that are narrowly tailored to detect specific categories of sensitive data, such as PII and financial information, based on defined business needs and regulatory requirements, and focus monitoring on data transfers that pose a significant risk. Option B. Disable all DLP monitoring for internal network traffic, focusing only on external egress points to minimize employee privacy concerns and administrative overhead. Option C. Configure DLP policies to broadly monitor all employee communications and data transfers, flagging any mention of keywords or patterns, to ensure no sensitive data is ever mishandled. Option D. Rely exclusively on user-reported incidents and manual reviews to identify potential data loss events, without implementing automated monitoring policies. The correct answer is C. Configure DLP policies to broadly monitor all employee communications and data transfers, flagging any mention of keywords or patterns, to ensure no sensitive data is ever mishandled. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge in data loss prevention administration, balancing the need for comprehensive monitoring with the legal and ethical obligations regarding employee privacy. The Symantec Data Loss Prevention DLP-15 platform is designed to detect and prevent sensitive data from leaving an organization's control, but its implementation must adhere to specific regulatory frameworks. For this exam, we assume the jurisdiction is the United States, and therefore, relevant regulations include those governing data privacy and employee monitoring, such as the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, ECPA, and various state-specific privacy laws. The professionally challenging aspect lies in configuring DLP policies to effectively identify and flag policy violations without inadvertently infringing on employees' reasonable expectations of privacy. This requires a nuanced understanding of what constitutes sensitive data under relevant regulations and a careful calibration of monitoring levels. Overly broad policies can lead to legal repercussions and damage employee trust, while overly lax policies can fail to meet compliance requirements and expose the organization to data breach risks. The correct approach involves a policy configuration that is narrowly tailored to detect specific types of sensitive data that the organization has a legitimate business interest in protecting, such as financial information, personally identifiable information, PI, or intellectual property, as defined by applicable U.S. federal and state laws. This approach prioritizes the protection of critical data assets while minimizing the intrusion into employee communications. It aligns with the principle of least privilege and data minimization, which are often implicitly or explicitly required by privacy regulations. By focusing on the content of communications and data transfers that are demonstrably sensitive and relevant to business operations or regulatory requirements, the organization acts in a manner consistent with legal obligations and ethical considerations. An incorrect approach that involves broadly monitoring all employee communications, regardless of content or context, for any mention of keywords or patterns, fails to respect employee privacy rights. This could violate the ECPA, which protects electronic communications from unauthorized interception, and state privacy laws that may impose stricter requirements. Such a broad approach is not justified by a legitimate business need and creates an environment of pervasive surveillance, which is ethically questionable and legally risky. Another incorrect approach, which is to disable all DLP monitoring for internal network traffic, leaving only external egress points monitored, is also professionally unacceptable. While it might reduce privacy concerns, it creates a significant blind spot for data exfiltration that could occur through internal channels or to cloud services not explicitly classified as external egress. This failure to adequately protect sensitive data would likely violate data protection mandates and industry best practices, exposing the organization to substantial risk. Finally, an approach that relies solely on user-reported incidents without proactive monitoring mechanisms is insufficient for a robust DLP strategy. While user reporting is valuable, it is reactive and depends on employees recognizing and reporting potential violations, which is unreliable for preventing widespread data leakage. This passive approach fails to meet the proactive security and compliance obligations expected of an organization administering a DLP solution. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough risk assessment, a clear understanding of the organization's data assets and regulatory obligations, and a collaborative approach involving legal counsel, HR, and IT security. Policies should be developed with a focus on proportionality, necessity, and transparency, ensuring that monitoring is limited to what is strictly required to protect sensitive data and meet compliance requirements, while respecting employee privacy. Regular review and auditing of DLP policies and their effectiveness are also crucial. Question 7. Process analysis reveals a significant and unexplained increase in the volume of Symantec data loss prevention, 15 incidents across the organization. Which of the following administrative approaches best addresses this situation to ensure effective data protection and operational efficiency? Option A. Immediately increase the sensitivity of all existing DLP policies across all detection channels to capture more potential incidents. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment to identify the most critical data types and high-risk incident scenarios, then prioritize remediation efforts based on this assessment. Option C. Focus on increasing the overall number of DLP incidents logged by the system, regardless of their nature or severity, to demonstrate heightened DLP activity. Option D. Maintain the current DLP policy configuration and incident reporting thresholds, assuming the increase is a temporary anomaly. The correct answer is B. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment to identify the most critical data types and high-risk incident scenarios, then prioritize remediation efforts based on this assessment. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in DLP administration, balancing the need for comprehensive data protection with the practicalities of resource allocation and potential impact on business operations. The organization is facing a significant increase in DLP incidents, suggesting either a rise in actual data exfiltration attempts or an oversensitivity of the DLP policies. The challenge lies in determining the root cause and implementing an effective, sustainable solution without causing undue disruption or missing critical threats. A hasty or misdirected response could lead to either a false sense of security or excessive operational overhead. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic risk assessment to identify the most critical data types and the highest risk scenarios contributing to the incident surge. This aligns with Symantec Data Loss Prevention 15 capabilities and best practices for DLP program management. By prioritizing based on business impact and regulatory requirements, e.g., PI, financial data, intellectual property, administrators can focus remediation efforts where they are most needed. This approach ensures that resources are allocated efficiently, addressing the most significant risks first. It also allows for a more nuanced tuning of DLP policies, reducing false positives while maintaining effective detection of genuine threats. This methodical process is crucial for demonstrating due diligence and compliance with data protection principles, even without specific regulatory mandates dictating incident volume thresholds. Incorrect approach is analysis. Implementing a blanket increase in DLP policy sensitivity across all channels without a prior risk assessment is a flawed approach. This would likely lead to an overwhelming number of false positives, inundating the security team, obscuring genuine threats, and potentially disrupting legitimate business processes. It fails to address the underlying cause of the incident surge and is an inefficient use of resources. Ignoring the incident surge and continuing with the current DLP configuration is also professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a lack of proactive security management and a failure to respond to potential indicators of compromise or policy misconfiguration. It leaves the organization vulnerable to data breaches and regulatory scrutiny if the incidents represent actual data loss. Focusing solely on increasing the number of DLP incidents reported without investigating the nature or severity of these incidents is a misdirected effort. The goal of DLP is to prevent data loss, not simply to generate more alerts. This approach prioritizes quantity over quality and does not contribute to effective risk mitigation. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the context and potential impact. A structured risk assessment framework, which involves identifying assets, threats, vulnerabilities, and the likelihood and impact of data loss, is paramount. This allows for informed decision-making regarding policy tuning, incident response, and resource allocation. When faced with an increase in DLP incidents, the professional decision-making process should involve 1. Data gathering. Analyze the nature, source, and destination of the DLP incidents. 2. Risk prioritization. Identify which data types and incident scenarios pose the greatest risk to the organization based on business impact and regulatory considerations. 3. Root cause analysis. Investigate why the incident volume has increased, e.g., policy misconfiguration, increased malicious activity, user training gaps. 4. Targeted remediation. Implement specific actions to address the identified risks and root causes, which may include policy tuning, user education, or technical controls. 5. Continuous monitoring and improvement. Regularly review DLP performance and adjust strategies as needed. Question 8. The assessment process reveals that the Symantec data loss prevention system is generating a high volume of alerts for potential policy violations related to customer contact information being shared via email. While the intention is to prevent unauthorized disclosure, the current configuration is causing significant delays in customer service communications and has led to user complaints about the system's intrusiveness. Which of the following approaches best addresses this situation while adhering to regulatory requirements for data protection? Option A. Conduct a detailed risk assessment to identify specific categories of customer contact information that are most sensitive and require the strictest controls, and then refine DLP policies to target these categories with appropriate detection and blocking mechanisms, while allowing for less stringent monitoring of less sensitive contact details. Option B. Implement a blanket policy to block all outbound emails containing any form of customer contact information, regardless of the recipient or context, to ensure maximum protection against data leakage. Option C. Immediately disable the DLP policies related to customer contact information to alleviate user complaints and restore normal communication flow, with a plan to reevaluate the policies at a later, unspecified date. Option D. Rely on the default DLP policy templates provided by Symantec for handling contact information, assuming they are universally applicable and sufficient for the organization's specific regulatory obligations. The correct answer is A. Conduct a detailed risk assessment to identify specific categories of customer contact information that are most sensitive and require the strictest controls, and then refine DLP policies to target these categories with appropriate detection and blocking mechanisms, while allowing for less stringent monitoring of less sensitive contact details. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a common challenge in Symantec data loss prevention, DLP, administration, balancing the need for comprehensive data protection with the practicalities of system performance and user impact. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires administrators to make informed decisions about risk tolerance, which is inherently subjective and context-dependent. A purely technical approach, focusing solely on blocking all potential data exfiltration, can lead to significant operational disruption and user frustration, potentially undermining the overall security posture. Conversely, an overly permissive approach risks significant data breaches and regulatory noncompliance. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it aligns with a structured, risk-based methodology for DLP implementation. This involves understanding the organization's specific data assets, the threats they face, and the regulatory landscape. By prioritizing the protection of the most sensitive data and implementing controls that are proportionate to the identified risks, administrators can achieve a more effective and sustainable DLP solution. This approach is often mandated or strongly implied by regulatory frameworks that require organizations to implement reasonable security measures to protect sensitive information, such as the U.S. Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA, for protected health information, or the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, PCI DSS, for cardholder data. These regulations do not typically prescribe a single technical solution, but rather a framework for risk management and data protection. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on implementing the most aggressive detection and blocking policies without a thorough risk assessment is professionally unacceptable. This can lead to a high rate of false positives, disrupting legitimate business operations and potentially leading to the blocking of critical communications or data transfers. From a regulatory perspective, this approach might be seen as overly burdensome and not a reasonable security measure, potentially leading to complaints and investigations. It fails to demonstrate a nuanced understanding of the organization's risk appetite and business needs. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes user convenience over robust data protection is equally professionally unacceptable. This might involve disabling or significantly relaxing policies for certain user groups or data types deemed less critical without a formal risk assessment. This creates significant security gaps and exposes the organization to potential data breaches and associated regulatory penalties. Ethically, administrators have a duty to protect sensitive data, and prioritizing convenience over this duty is a failure. A third incorrect approach that relies on outdated or generic policy templates without customization for the specific organizational context is also problematic. While templates can be a starting point, they often do not account for the unique data flows, business processes, and regulatory obligations of a particular organization. This can result in policies that are either too lax or too restrictive, failing to provide adequate protection or causing unnecessary operational friction. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to adapt security measures to the specific environment, which can be a point of failure in regulatory compliance audits. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic risk assessment. This begins with identifying critical data assets and understanding their sensitivity and value. Next, potential threats and vulnerabilities related to these assets must be analyzed. Based on this analysis, the organization's risk tolerance should be defined, considering both the potential impact of a data breach and the cost of implementing protective measures. Finally, DLP policies and configurations should be designed and implemented to align with this risk assessment, with ongoing monitoring and refinement to adapt to evolving threats and business needs. This iterative, risk-based approach ensures that DLP efforts are targeted, effective, and compliant with relevant regulations. Question 9. The control framework reveals that the Symantec Data Loss Prevention 15 system has identified a significant number of potential policy violations across various departments. Given limited resources for immediate remediation, which of the following approaches best aligns with a robust and compliant risk management strategy for addressing these findings? Option A. Implement broad, system-wide policy changes to address all identified violations simultaneously, without specific prioritization. Option B. Prioritize remediation efforts based on the potential impact of the data involved and the likelihood of the violation occurring, focusing on the highest risk findings first. Option C. Address all identified policy violations in the order they appear in the DLP incident queue, regardless of their potential severity or impact. Option D. Focus remediation efforts exclusively on departments that have historically experienced the most data loss incidents, ignoring new or emerging risk areas. The correct answer is B. Prioritize remediation efforts based on the potential impact of the data involved and the likelihood of the violation occurring, focusing on the highest risk findings first. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in data loss prevention, balancing the need for comprehensive risk identification with the practical limitations of resources and the dynamic nature of the threat landscape. The professional challenge lies in prioritizing remediation efforts effectively to maximize impact and compliance within budgetary and operational constraints. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the risk assessment process is not merely a procedural exercise, but a strategic tool for safeguarding sensitive data. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly aligns with the principles of a proactive and adaptive risk management strategy. By focusing on the highest impact risks, it ensures that limited resources are allocated where they will provide the greatest reduction in potential data breaches and associated regulatory penalties. This approach demonstrates due diligence and a commitment to fulfilling the organization's obligations under relevant data protection regulations, such as those that would be enforced by U.S. regulatory bodies like the FTC or SEC, which mandate reasonable security measures and prompt disclosure of breaches. It prioritizes the protection of sensitive data based on its criticality and the likelihood of exploitation, which is a core tenet of effective information security governance. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the number of identified vulnerabilities without considering their severity or potential impact represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This could lead to misallocation of resources, leaving high-risk areas unprotected while expending effort on low-impact issues. This failure to prioritize effectively could be seen as a breach of the duty of care owed to data subjects and a violation of regulatory requirements that expect organizations to implement controls commensurate with the risks they face. Another incorrect approach that relies solely on historical incident data, without considering emerging threats or new data processing activities, is also professionally unacceptable. This static view fails to account for the evolving nature of cyber threats and the introduction of new data types or systems that may carry novel risks. Such an approach could result in a false sense of security and leave the organization vulnerable to previously unaddressed threats, potentially leading to regulatory noncompliance and reputational damage. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a multifaceted risk assessment methodology. This includes 1. Asset identification, understanding what sensitive data exists and where it resides. 2. Threat identification, recognizing potential internal and external threats. 3. Vulnerability assessment, identifying weaknesses in controls and systems. 4. Impact analysis, quantifying the potential business and regulatory consequences of a data breach. 5. Likelihood assessment, estimating the probability of a threat exploiting a vulnerability. 6. Risk prioritization, ranking risks based on a combination of impact and likelihood. 7. Remediation planning, developing and implementing controls to mitigate prioritized risks. This systematic process ensures that risk management is data-driven, aligned with business objectives, and compliant with regulatory expectations. Question 10. Consider a scenario where a Symantec data loss prevention administrator is tasked with developing a comprehensive data loss prevention strategy for a growing organization. The organization handles a wide range of data, from customer PII to proprietary intellectual property, and operates across multiple departments with varying data handling practices. The administrator needs to establish an effective DLP program that minimizes risk without unduly hindering business operations. Which of the following approaches would best align with professional best practices for administering Symantec data loss prevention 15 in this context? Option A. Conduct a thorough data discovery and classification exercise to understand the types and locations of sensitive data, followed by a targeted risk assessment to identify high-risk data flows and potential vulnerabilities, and then develop policies based on these findings. Option B. Focus solely on configuring keyword and regular expression matching for common sensitive data elements across all network traffic and endpoints. Option C. Begin by implementing broad, restrictive DLP policies across all data types and systems to ensure maximum protection from the outset. Option D. Wait for user-reported incidents or security alerts to identify areas where DLP policies are needed. The correct answer is C. Begin by implementing broad, restrictive DLP policies across all data types and systems to ensure maximum protection from the outset. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in data loss prevention administration, balancing the need for comprehensive risk assessment with the practical limitations of resources and the potential for operational disruption. The administrator must identify and prioritize data risks without causing undue burden on business operations or missing critical vulnerabilities. The challenge lies in developing a systematic and defensible approach that aligns with organizational objectives and regulatory expectations for data protection. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a phased risk assessment methodology that begins with broad data discovery and classification, followed by targeted analysis of high-risk areas. This aligns with best practices for Symantec data loss prevention administration by enabling a scalable and efficient identification of sensitive data and potential exposure points. It allows for the prioritization of remediation efforts based on the likelihood and impact of data breaches, thereby optimizing resource allocation. This systematic approach is crucial for demonstrating due diligence in data protection efforts, which is often a requirement under various data privacy regulations, although specific regulations are not cited for this exam. By focusing on understanding data flows and potential vulnerabilities before implementing broad controls, the administrator can ensure that DLP policies are effective and tailored to the organization's specific risk profile. Incorrect approaches analysis. Implementing broad, restrictive DLP policies across all data types and systems without a prior risk assessment is professionally unacceptable. This approach fails to account for the varying sensitivity of data and the potential for significant operational disruption. It can lead to the blocking of legitimate business processes, user frustration, and a false sense of security by focusing on low-risk data while potentially overlooking critical vulnerabilities. Such an unfocused strategy is inefficient and does not demonstrate a risk-based approach to data protection, which is a cornerstone of effective compliance and security programs. Focusing solely on technical scanning for specific keywords or patterns without understanding the context of the data and its business use is also professionally flawed. While keyword scanning is a component of DLP, it is insufficient on its own. Data can be sensitive even if it doesn't contain specific keywords, and keywords can appear in non-sensitive contexts. This approach neglects the broader risk landscape, including data exfiltration methods beyond simple text matching and the potential for insider threats. It fails to provide a holistic view of data risk and can lead to both missed threats and unnecessary alerts. Relying exclusively on user-reported incidents to identify data risks is a reactive and inadequate strategy. This approach means that data loss has already occurred, negating the preventative purpose of a DLP solution. It fails to proactively identify vulnerabilities and potential risks before they materialize into incidents. A robust risk assessment process is inherently proactive, aiming to prevent data loss rather than merely responding to it. This reactive stance is a significant failure in professional data protection administration. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a proactive and risk-based approach to data loss prevention. This involves understanding the organization's data landscape, identifying critical data assets, and assessing the potential threats and vulnerabilities associated with them. The Symantec Data Loss Prevention Platform provides tools to facilitate this by enabling data discovery, classification, and policy creation based on risk. A structured risk assessment process, often involving multiple phases from broad discovery to detailed analysis of high-risk areas, ensures that resources are allocated effectively and that DLP controls are aligned with business objectives and regulatory requirements. This systematic methodology allows for continuous improvement and adaptation of the DLP strategy as the threat landscape and organizational data evolve. Question 11. The investigation demonstrates that a critical alert has been triggered within Symantec Data Loss Prevention 15, indicating a potential exfiltration of sensitive customer financial data. While the immediate impulse is to deploy a broad set of restrictive DLP policies to prevent further data loss, what is the most professionally sound and regulatory compliant approach to managing this situation? Option A. Temporarily disable the alerting mechanism for sensitive financial data until the IT team can address the backlog of other high-priority security tasks. Option B. Deploy a wide range of restrictive DLP policies across all systems to broadly prevent any further data movement, regardless of specific risk context. Option C. Immediately complete a comprehensive risk assessment to understand the scope, impact, and likelihood of the data exfiltration before implementing targeted remediation controls. Option D. Focus solely on addressing the immediate alert by investigating the specific user and system involved without considering the broader data landscape or potential systemic issues. The correct answer is C. Immediately complete a comprehensive risk assessment to understand the scope, impact, and likelihood of the data exfiltration before implementing targeted remediation controls. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need to address a potential data breach with the long-term strategic imperative of a comprehensive risk assessment. Rushing to implement controls without understanding the full scope and impact of the risk can lead to inefficient resource allocation, ineffective solutions, and potential regulatory noncompliance if the chosen controls don't adequately address the identified risks. The Symantec Data Loss Prevention 15 framework emphasizes a structured approach to risk management, which includes thorough assessment before remediation. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves prioritizing the completion of the risk assessment before implementing specific remediation controls. This aligns with best professional practice and regulatory expectations for data protection. A comprehensive risk assessment, as facilitated by Symantec DLP, identifies the types of sensitive data at risk, the potential impact of a breach, and the likelihood of such an event occurring. This allows for the selection of targeted and effective DLP policies and controls that directly address the most critical risks. For example, under U.S. regulations like HIPAA or GDPR, though we are strictly adhering to U.S. frameworks for this exam. A documented risk assessment is a foundational requirement for establishing appropriate safeguards. Failing to conduct this assessment first means controls might be misapplied, leaving critical vulnerabilities unaddressed or wasting resources on less significant threats. Incorrect approach is analysis. Implementing broad, generic DLP policies without a prior risk assessment is professionally unacceptable because it represents a reactive and potentially inefficient approach. This could lead to the misclassification of data, excessive false positives, and a failure to address the most critical risks. From a U.S. regulatory perspective, this approach lacks the due diligence required to demonstrate a proactive and risk-based security posture, potentially violating the spirit of regulations that mandate reasonable security measures. Focusing solely on the immediate alert without understanding its context within the broader data landscape is also a failure. This narrow focus ignores the possibility that the alert might be a symptom of a larger, systemic risk. A proper risk assessment would contextualize this alert, helping to determine if it's an isolated incident or indicative of a widespread vulnerability. Without this context, remediation efforts may be superficial and fail to prevent future, more significant incidents, which could be seen as a failure to implement adequate safeguards under U.S. data protection laws. Ignoring the alert entirely due to resource constraints is a critical regulatory and ethical failure. Data loss prevention is a continuous process, and ignoring alerts, especially those that might indicate a significant risk, directly contravenes the principles of data protection and could lead to severe penalties under U.S. regulations if a breach occurs. It demonstrates a lack of commitment to protecting sensitive information and a disregard for potential harm to individuals whose data is compromised. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes a structured, risk-based approach. This involves 1. Understanding the regulatory landscape relevant to the data being protected, e.g., U.S. federal and state laws. 2. Leveraging tools like Symantec DLP to conduct a thorough risk assessment, identifying critical data assets, potential threats, and vulnerabilities. 3. Prioritizing remediation efforts based on the findings of the risk assessment, focusing on the highest impact risks first. 4. Implementing and continuously monitoring DLP policies and controls, regularly reviewing and updating them based on evolving threats and business needs. 5. Documenting all assessment and remediation activities to demonstrate compliance and due diligence. Question 12. Upon reviewing the Symantec Data Loss Prevention 15 environment, an administrator is tasked with developing a comprehensive risk assessment strategy. The organization handles a wide range of sensitive data, including financial records, customer personally identifiable information, PI, and intellectual property. The administrator needs to determine the most effective initial steps to identify and prioritize potential data loss risks within the existing infrastructure and workflows. Which of the following approaches would best serve as the foundation for a robust and efficient risk assessment? Option A. Focus exclusively on identifying technical vulnerabilities in the network infrastructure and endpoint security solutions that could be exploited for data theft. Option B. Implement broad, generic detection rules across all network traffic and endpoints to capture any potential data exfiltration attempts, regardless of data type. Option C. Begin by identifying and classifying the organization's most critical data assets and mapping their associated workflows to understand where sensitive information resides and how it is processed. Option D. Wait for a data loss incident to occur before developing and implementing specific DLP policies and detection rules. Correct answer is C. Begin by identifying and classifying the organization's most critical data assets and mapping their associated workflows to understand where sensitive information resides and how it is processed. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in data loss prevention administration, balancing the need for comprehensive risk assessment with the practical limitations of resources and the dynamic nature of data flow. The administrator must identify potential vulnerabilities without causing undue disruption or overwhelming the system with false positives. The challenge lies in prioritizing efforts effectively to address the most significant risks first, ensuring compliance with Symantec data loss prevention 15 capabilities, and underlying regulatory expectations for data protection. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a phased risk assessment that begins with identifying critical data assets and their associated workflows. This aligns with best practices for DLP implementation, which emphasize understanding what data needs protection before deploying controls. By focusing on high-value or sensitive data first, the administrator can ensure that the most significant risks are addressed efficiently. This methodical approach allows for the iterative refinement of policies and detection rules, minimizing the impact on legitimate business operations while maximizing the effectiveness of the DLP solution. This aligns with the principle of proportionality in data protection, ensuring that protective measures are commensurate with the risks identified. Incorrect approaches analysis. Implementing broad, generic detection rules across all data types without initial prioritization is an inefficient and potentially disruptive approach. This can lead to a high volume of false positives, overwhelming the incident response team and obscuring genuine threats. It fails to acknowledge the varying levels of sensitivity and risk associated with different data categories, thus not representing a targeted or effective use of DLP resources. Focusing solely on technical vulnerabilities without considering the business context and data flow is also problematic. While technical safeguards are important, DLP's effectiveness is maximized when it understands the business processes that handle sensitive data. Ignoring this aspect can lead to the implementation of controls that are technically sound but practically ineffective or easily bypassed. Adopting a reactive approach, where policies are only developed after an incident occurs, is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Proactive risk assessment and mitigation are fundamental to data protection regulations. This approach demonstrates a lack of due diligence and preparedness, potentially exposing the organization to significant legal and reputational damage. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach DLP risk assessment by first understanding the organization's data landscape and regulatory obligations. This involves identifying critical data assets, mapping data flows, and understanding the business processes that handle this data. A phased implementation, starting with the highest risk areas, allows for continuous improvement and adaptation. Regular review and refinement of policies based on incident analysis and evolving threats are crucial. This systematic and data-driven approach ensures that DLP resources are utilized effectively, compliance is maintained, and the organization's sensitive information is adequately protected. Question 13. The assessment process reveals a broad spectrum of data types within the organization, ranging from highly sensitive financial and personal identifiable information, PI, to less critical internal project documents. The DLP administration team has limited resources for immediate full-scale deployment and policy tuning, which approach best balances the need for effective data protection with resource constraints and regulatory compliance. Option A. Deploy DLP monitoring and policies across all identified data types simultaneously to ensure comprehensive coverage from the outset, regardless of sensitivity or risk level. Option B. Implement DLP controls primarily based on user roles and departments, prioritizing those with access to the largest volumes of data without a detailed initial assessment of data sensitivity. Option C. Focus initial DLP efforts on data types that are easiest to monitor and control, such as data residing on specific network shares, before addressing more complex data flows or sensitive information. Option D. Prioritize the implementation of DLP policies and monitoring for the most sensitive data types, e.g., PI, financial records, and highest-risk data transmission channels, followed by a phased rollout to other data categories based on ongoing risk assessments. The correct answer is D. Prioritize the implementation of DLP policies and monitoring for the most sensitive data types, e.g., PI, financial records, and highest-risk data transmission channels, followed by a phased rollout to other data categories based on ongoing risk assessments. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in data loss prevention, DLP, administration, balancing the need for comprehensive risk assessment with the practical limitations of resource allocation and the potential for alert fatigue. The core difficulty lies in prioritizing which data types and associated risks to address first when faced with a broad spectrum of potential vulnerabilities. A rushed or incomplete assessment can lead to overlooking critical risks, while an overly broad approach can dilute efforts and lead to ineffective controls. Professional judgment is required to identify the most impactful areas for immediate attention. Correct approach analysis. The The correct approach focuses on a phased implementation driven by a risk-based methodology. This aligns with best practices in information security and regulatory compliance, which emphasize prioritizing efforts based on the likelihood and impact of potential data breaches. By first identifying and assessing the most sensitive data types, e.g., PI, financial data, intellectual property, and the highest risk scenarios, e.g., data exfiltration via email, cloud storage, or removable media, administrators can ensure that the most critical vulnerabilities are addressed promptly. This approach is ethically sound as it demonstrates a commitment to protecting the most sensitive information first, thereby minimizing potential harm to individuals and the organization. From a regulatory perspective, many frameworks, e.g., GDPR, CCPA, HIPAA, depending on the jurisdiction implicitly assumed by the exam's focus on U.S. regulations, mandate a risk-based approach to data protection, requiring organizations to identify and mitigate risks to personal data. This phased, risk-driven strategy ensures that resources are allocated effectively to meet these obligations. Incorrect approach is analysis. Implementing DLP controls for all data types simultaneously without a prior risk assessment is an inefficient and potentially ineffective strategy. It can lead to overwhelming the system with alerts, making it difficult to identify genuine threats and increasing the likelihood of alert fatigue among security personnel. This approach fails to demonstrate a structured, risk-informed approach to data protection, which could be viewed as a regulatory or ethical failing if critical data is left unprotected due to a lack of prioritization. Focusing solely on data types that are easiest to monitor or control, irrespective of their sensitivity or the associated risks, is also problematic. This approach prioritizes convenience over security and may leave the organization exposed to significant risks from more complex or less obvious data flows. It neglects the fundamental principle of risk management, which is to address the most significant threats first. Ethically, this could be seen as a dereliction of duty if sensitive data is compromised, because less critical data was prioritized for monitoring. Ignoring the potential for user impact and focusing only on technical controls can lead to a system that is overly restrictive and hinders legitimate business operations. While security is paramount, an approach that does not consider usability can lead to workarounds that bypass DLP controls, ultimately undermining the program's effectiveness. This can also create an adversarial relationship between IT security and end users, which is counterproductive. From a regulatory standpoint, while not a direct violation, it can indirectly lead to noncompliance if the DLP solution is not effectively implemented due to user resistance or circumvention. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic, risk-based approach to DLP implementation. This involves understanding the organization's data landscape, identifying sensitive data categories, assessing potential threats and vulnerabilities, and then prioritizing the implementation of DLP policies and controls based on the potential impact and likelihood of a data breach. This iterative process allows for continuous improvement and adaptation to evolving threats and business needs. The decision-making process should involve collaboration with business stakeholders to ensure that DLP solutions are effective, efficient, and aligned with business objectives, while also meeting regulatory and ethical obligations. Question 14. Examination of the data shows a consistent increase in low-severity DLP incidents over the past quarter, primarily related to the sharing of internal project documentation via email. The security operations team is spending a significant amount of time triaging these alerts, many of which are identified as false positives due to legitimate internal collaboration. Symantec Data Loss Prevention 15 administrator needs to address this without compromising the detection of high-risk data exfiltration. Which of the following approaches best addresses this situation? Option A. Implement new, more aggressive detection rules across all channels to capture any potential data sharing, regardless of severity, to ensure no data leaves the organization. Option B. Continue with the current configuration, assuming the increase in alerts is a temporary anomaly and the security operations team can manage the workload. Option C. Immediately disable the detection rules that are generating the most low-severity incidents to reduce the alert volume and free up the security operations team's time. Option D. Analyze the specific detection rules generating the majority of these low-severity alerts, identify patterns of legitimate sharing, and refine the rules by adjusting sensitivity thresholds, adding specific exceptions for approved internal distribution lists, or creating more granular detection logic to differentiate between accidental and intentional data leakage. The correct answer is D. Analyze the specific detection rules generating the majority of these low-severity alerts, identify patterns of legitimate sharing, and refine the rules by adjusting sensitivity thresholds, adding specific exceptions for approved internal distribution lists, or creating more granular detection logic to differentiate between accidental and intentional data leakage. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in data loss prevention (DLP) administration, balancing the need for comprehensive monitoring with the potential for over-alerting and impacting user productivity. The administrator must evaluate the effectiveness of existing detection rules and determine if adjustments are necessary to maintain security posture without creating undue operational overhead or user friction. The challenge lies in accurately assessing the noise generated by the DLP system and identifying genuine risks versus false positives, all within the context of Symantec DLP 15 capabilities and best practices for its administration. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic, data-driven evaluation of DLP incident trends. This means analyzing the types of incidents being generated, their frequency, and their potential impact. By correlating these incidents with specific detection rules, the administrator can identify rules that are generating a high volume of low-severity or false positive alerts. The next step is to refine these rules, perhaps by adjusting sensitivity levels, adding exceptions for legitimate business processes, or combining rules to create more precise detection logic. This iterative process ensures that the DLP system remains effective in identifying actual data exfiltration attempts while minimizing the burden of reviewing non-critical alerts. This aligns with best practices for Symantec DLP administration, which emphasize tuning and optimization to achieve a balance between security and operational efficiency. Incorrect approach is analysis. Disabling detection rules without thorough analysis is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It creates a blind spot in the organization's data protection strategy, potentially allowing sensitive data to be exfiltrated without detection. This directly contravenes the purpose of implementing a DLP solution and could lead to breaches of data privacy regulations, e.g., if the data involved is personal information or industry-specific compliance requirements. Implementing overly broad or sensitive detection rules without considering their impact on user workflows is also problematic. While seemingly proactive, it can lead to a deluge of false positives, overwhelming the security team and potentially masking genuine threats. This can also lead to user frustration and a perception that the DLP system is a hindrance rather than a safeguard, potentially encouraging users to find workarounds that bypass security controls. Ignoring the incident reporting and alert volume and continuing with the status quo represents a failure to adapt and optimize the DLP system. Over time, the threat landscape evolves and business processes change. A static DLP configuration will inevitably become less effective, increasing the risk of both missed threats and unnecessary operational overhead. This passive approach fails to meet the ongoing responsibility of maintaining an effective data loss prevention program. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach DLP rule management with a mindset of continuous improvement. The decision-making process should involve 1. Establishing baseline metrics for incident volume and types. 2. Regularly reviewing incident reports to identify trends and anomalies. 3. Correlating incidents with specific detection rules to pinpoint areas for tuning. 4. Prioritizing rule adjustments based on potential risk and impact. 5. Testing rule changes in a controlled environment before full deployment. 6. Documenting all changes and their rationale. 7. Communicating significant changes to relevant stakeholders. This systematic approach ensures that the DLP system remains a valuable asset, effectively protecting sensitive data while minimizing disruption. Question 15. Performance analysis shows a significant increase in false positive alerts generated by the Symantec Data Loss Prevention 15 system, impacting the efficiency of the Security Operations Center. Which of the following approaches best addresses this situation while maintaining effective data protection? Option A. Immediately disable all DLP policies that are generating the most false positives to reduce the alert volume and allow the security team to focus on other tasks. Option B. Conduct a detailed review of the high-volume, false positive alerts to identify common patterns and contexts, then systematically refine specific DLP policies and detection rules based on this analysis, potentially excluding legitimate business processes where appropriate. Option C. Broadly reduce the sensitivity of all DLP detection rules across the entire system to decrease the number of alerts generated. Option D. Continue operating with the current DLP policy configuration, assuming the false positives are an unavoidable byproduct of comprehensive monitoring. The correct answer is B. Conduct a detailed review of the high-volume, false positive alerts to identify common patterns and contexts, then systematically refine specific DLP policies and detection rules based on this analysis, potentially excluding legitimate business processes where appropriate. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in DLP administration, balancing proactive threat detection with the potential for operational disruption. The performance analysis indicates a significant increase in false positives, which can lead to alert fatigue for security analysts, increased workload for incident response teams, and potentially impact the efficiency of legitimate business processes if policies are overly aggressive. The professional challenge lies in refining the DLP system to accurately identify genuine data exfiltration attempts without hindering productivity or overwhelming the security team. This requires a nuanced understanding of the organization's data handling practices and a strategic approach to policy tuning. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic and data-driven refinement of DLP policies. This begins with a thorough review of the high-volume false positive alerts to identify common patterns, keywords, or contexts that are being incorrectly flagged. Based on this analysis, policies should be adjusted by fine-tuning detection rules, excluding specific legitimate business processes or user groups from certain checks, or implementing more sophisticated contextual analysis. This iterative process of analysis, adjustment, and reevaluation ensures that the DLP system becomes more accurate and efficient over time, aligning with best practices for operationalizing DLP solutions. This approach directly addresses the performance issue by improving the signal-to-noise ratio of alerts, thereby enhancing the effectiveness of the security team and minimizing operational impact, which is a core objective of effective DLP administration. Incorrect approach is analysis. Disabling the DLP system entirely or significantly reducing its monitoring scope without a clear understanding of the root cause of the false positives is a regulatory and ethical failure. This action would leave the organization vulnerable to actual data breaches, violating the fundamental purpose of implementing a DLP solution. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence in protecting sensitive information. Implementing broad, sweeping changes to all DLP policies without targeted analysis is also problematic. This approach risks introducing new false negatives, potentially allowing actual data exfiltration to go undetected. It also fails to address the specific issue of false positives, leading to an inefficient and potentially ineffective DLP deployment. This can be seen as a failure to competently administer the system and fulfill the organization's security obligations. Ignoring the performance analysis and continuing with the current policy configuration is a failure to proactively manage the DLP system. This leads to continued alert fatigue, wasted resources, and a diminished ability to detect genuine threats, ultimately undermining the organization's security posture and potentially leading to regulatory noncompliance if data protection mandates are not met. Professional reasoning. Professionals faced with this situation should adopt a structured problem-solving methodology. First, acknowledge and quantify the performance issue through the provided analysis. Second, prioritize understanding the root cause of the false positives by examining the specific alerts and the data they relate to. Third, develop a hypothesis for policy adjustments based on this understanding. Fourth, implement targeted, incremental changes to the DLP policies, carefully documenting each modification. Fifth, monitor the impact of these changes on both false positive rates and the detection of genuine incidents. This iterative feedback loop is crucial for effective DLP tuning and ensures that the system remains both protective and practical. Question 16. Benchmark analysis indicates that a Symantec data loss prevention 15 policy designed to prevent the unauthorized exfiltration of financial data is generating an unusually high volume of false positive alerts, impacting the productivity of the sales team. The administrator needs to address this issue to improve operational efficiency and maintain effective data protection. Which of the following actions represents the most professional and compliant approach? Option A. Implement a broad exception for all outbound email traffic originating from the sales department to eliminate all future alerts. Option B. Ignore the false positive alerts and continue to monitor the system, assuming the alerts will eventually decrease on their own. Option C. Conduct a detailed review of the false positive incidents, analyzing the content, context, and metadata of the flagged data to identify specific patterns and refine the policy rules and exceptions. Option D. Temporarily disable the DLP policy for the sales department until a full investigation can be completed to avoid further disruption. The correct answer is D. Temporarily disable the DLP policy for the sales department until a full investigation can be completed to avoid further disruption. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in data loss prevention (DLP) administration, balancing the need for comprehensive monitoring with the potential for over-alerting and impacting legitimate business operations. The administrator must interpret the effectiveness of a DLP policy not just by its technical implementation, but by its real-world impact on data handling and compliance. The challenge lies in identifying the root cause of a high false positive rate without compromising the integrity of the DLP system's ability to detect genuine threats. This requires a nuanced understanding of both the technology and the business processes it aims to protect. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic investigation into the specific types of data and communication channels generating the false positives. This includes reviewing the DLP policy's rules, conditions, and exceptions to understand why legitimate data is being flagged. By analyzing the content, context, and metadata of the flagged incidents, the administrator can identify patterns that indicate misconfigurations or overly broad rules. This methodical approach, focusing on data analysis and policy refinement, directly supports the goal of maintaining an effective DLP posture while minimizing operational disruption. It aligns with best practices for DLP administration, which emphasize continuous monitoring, tuning, and improvement to ensure the system remains relevant and efficient. From a regulatory perspective, this proactive and data-driven approach helps demonstrate due diligence in protecting sensitive information, a key requirement under various data protection frameworks. Incorrect approaches analysis. Disabling the DLP policy entirely or significantly reducing its sensitivity without a thorough investigation is a critical regulatory and ethical failure. This action creates a blind spot, leaving sensitive data vulnerable to unauthorized disclosure and potentially violating data protection regulations that mandate reasonable security measures. It demonstrates a lack of commitment to data security and compliance, ignoring the false positive alerts and continuing with the current policy configuration is also professionally unacceptable. This approach neglects the operational inefficiency caused by excessive alerts and fails to address the underlying issues that are diminishing the policy's effectiveness. It can lead to alert fatigue, where genuine threats are overlooked, thereby increasing the risk of a data breach and noncompliance. This passive stance undermines the purpose of implementing a DLP solution. Implementing broad, blanket exceptions for entire departments or data types without granular analysis is another flawed strategy. While seemingly a quick fix, it can inadvertently allow sensitive data to flow unchecked, creating significant compliance risks. This approach lacks the precision required for effective data protection and can lead to unintended consequences, such as exposing data that should be protected. Professional reasoning. Professionals tasked with DLP administration should adopt a data-driven, iterative approach. When faced with a high false positive rate, the decision-making process should involve 1. Initial assessment, quantify the false positive rate and identify the scope of the problem. 2. Root cause analysis, investigate the specific incidents, rules, and data involved. 3. Policy refinement, tune rules, adjust sensitivity levels, and implement targeted exceptions based on evidence. 4. Testing and validation, monitor the impact of changes to ensure false positives are reduced without increasing the risk of false negatives. 5. Documentation, maintain records of all changes and the rationale behind them for audit and compliance purposes. This systematic process ensures that the DLP solution remains effective efficient, and compliant with relevant regulations. Question 17. Analysis of the most effective strategy for deploying Symantec data loss prevention 15 within a regulated financial institution to mitigate the risk of unauthorized disclosure of personally identifiable information, PI, and protected health information, FI, across both on-premises and cloud-based services, considering the need to minimize operational disruption and ensure compliance with U.S. federal data privacy regulations. Option A. Immediate deployment of comprehensive, out-of-the-box policies across all endpoints and cloud applications, with strict enforcement enabled from day one. Option B. Developing custom policies based on broad assumptions about sensitive data and enabling enforcement across all monitored systems without prior validation. Option C. Prioritizing the implementation of endpoint DLP agents only, with a plan to address cloud data protection in a subsequent project phase. Option D. A phased implementation starting with discovery and profiling of sensitive data, followed by policy development and testing in monitoring mode, and then gradual enforcement focused on high-risk data types and channels. The correct answer is D. A phased implementation starting with discovery and profiling of sensitive data, followed by policy development and testing in monitoring mode, and then gradual enforcement focused on high-risk data types and channels. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge in Symantec data loss prevention, DLP 15, balancing the need for comprehensive data protection with the operational realities of a dynamic IT environment. The challenge lies in accurately identifying and classifying sensitive data across diverse endpoints and cloud applications, without introducing excessive false positives or negatively impacting user productivity. The organization is facing a potential breach of regulatory compliance due to a lack of granular control over sensitive data movement, necessitating a robust and effective DLP strategy. The pressure to implement a solution quickly, coupled with the complexity of the data landscape, requires careful planning and a phased approach to avoid disruption and ensure efficacy. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a phased implementation strategy that prioritizes critical data types and high-risk channels. This begins with a thorough discovery and profiling phase to understand the organization's data landscape and identify sensitive information. Subsequently, policies are developed and tested in a monitoring-only mode to assess their accuracy and identify potential false positives. This iterative process allows for refinement before enforcement is enabled, focusing on specific high-risk data categories, e.g., PI financial data and common exfiltration vectors, e.g., email web uploads, ensures that the most critical risks are addressed first. This aligns with best practices for DLP implementation, which advocate for a gradual rollout to minimize disruption and maximize effectiveness. By starting with monitoring, administrators can validate policy effectiveness and tune rules, thereby reducing the risk of blocking legitimate business processes and ensuring compliance with data protection regulations without causing undue operational impact. This methodical approach is crucial for demonstrating due diligence and maintaining a compliant posture. Incorrect approach is analysis. Implementing a broad, all-encompassing policy across all endpoints and cloud applications simultaneously without prior discovery and testing is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This approach is highly likely to generate a substantial number of false positives, disrupting legitimate business operations and potentially leading to non-compliance if critical data is inadvertently blocked. Demonstrates a lack of understanding of the organization's specific data risks and a failure to implement a proportionate and effective control. Enabling immediate enforcement of policies based on generic templates without customization or validation is another critical failure. Generic policies often do not account for the nuances of an organization's data usage and may not accurately identify sensitive information, leading to both missed threats and unnecessary disruptions. This can result in a failure to protect sensitive data as required by regulations, while simultaneously hindering business processes, which can also have compliance implications if it impedes the ability to conduct business operations as mandated. Focusing solely on endpoint protection and neglecting cloud application data flows overlooks a significant portion of modern data exfiltration risks. This creates a compliance gap, as sensitive data residing in or transiting through cloud services may not be adequately protected, leading to potential breaches and regulatory violations. It represents an incomplete and therefore ineffective implementation of a data loss prevention strategy. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based, phased approach to DLP implementation. This involves 1. Understanding the regulatory landscape and identifying applicable data protection requirements. 2. Conducting a comprehensive data discovery and classification exercise to understand what sensitive data exists and where it resides. 3. Prioritizing data types and channels based on risk and regulatory impact. 4. Developing and testing policies in a monitoring-only mode to validate accuracy and minimize false positives. 5. Gradually enabling enforcement for high-priority policies and data types. 6. Continuously monitoring, reviewing, and refining policies based on operational feedback and evolving threats. This systematic process ensures that DLP solutions are effective, proportionate, and aligned with both business needs and regulatory obligations. Question 18. Market research demonstrates that a new marketing campaign could significantly increase revenue. The marketing department requests the DLP administrator to configure a DLP policy that will scan outgoing emails for specific customer demographic information to identify potential leads for this campaign. The marketing team states that this is a standard practice for lead generation and assures the administrator that employee consent for this type of data usage is implied through their general employment agreement. The administrator is aware that the employment agreement does not explicitly mention the use of employee-identifying demographic data for third-party marketing lead generation. What is the most appropriate course of action for the DLP administrator? Option A. Implement the DLP policy, but immediately escalate the request to senior management and the legal department, highlighting the potential privacy concerns and lack of explicit consent. Option B. Implement the DLP policy only after verifying that explicit, informed consent has been obtained from all employees whose demographic data might be included in the scanned emails for this specific marketing purpose, or that the data can be anonymized to prevent identification. Option C. Implement the DLP policy as requested by the marketing department, relying on their assurance that it is standard practice and that employee consent is implied. Option D. Refuse to implement the policy and inform the marketing department that their request violates employee privacy rights and data protection regulations. The correct answer is C. Implement the DLP policy as requested by the marketing department, relying on their assurance that it is standard practice and that employee consent is implied. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a classic ethical dilemma where a DLP administrator is tasked with implementing a policy that could inadvertently expose sensitive personal data of employees to a third-party vendor for marketing purposes. Challenge lies in balancing the company's business objectives with the legal and ethical obligation to protect employee privacy. The administrator must navigate the potential for misuse of data, the lack of explicit employee consent for this specific marketing use, and the reputational risk to the company if a data breach or privacy violation occurs. The pressure to meet business goals can create a conflict of interest, making objective decision-making crucial. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough risk assessment and adherence to data privacy regulations. This includes understanding the specific data being collected, the purpose of its use by the third-party vendor, and whether explicit, informed consent has been obtained from employees for this particular marketing activity. If consent is lacking or ambiguous, the administrator should advocate for obtaining it or for anonymizing/aggregating the data to a point where it no longer constitutes personal data. This aligns with principles of data minimization, purpose limitation, and transparency, which are fundamental to data protection laws. The administrator's responsibility is to ensure that the DLP policy implementation does not facilitate a violation of these principles, even if it means delaying or modifying the business initiative. This upholds professional integrity and protects both the employees and the organization from legal and reputational damage. Incorrect approach is analysis. Implementing the policy without verifying employee consent for marketing use is a direct violation of data privacy principles. It treats employee data as a commodity for marketing without their knowledge or agreement, which is ethically unsound and likely illegal under various data protection frameworks. This approach risks significant fines, legal action, and severe damage to employee trust and the company's reputation. Proceeding with the policy based solely on the business unit's assurance that its standard practice is negligent. Professional responsibility requires due diligence beyond internal assurances, especially when personal data is involved. Relying on vague assurances without independent verification of compliance with data protection laws and ethical standards is a failure of professional duty. Escalating the issue to management without proposing a compliant solution or clearly articulating the risks is an abdication of responsibility. While escalation is sometimes necessary, a DLP administrator should first attempt to identify compliant alternatives or clearly define the noncompliance and its implications. Simply passing the problem up the chain without offering informed guidance is not best professional practice. Professional reasoning. Professionals in data protection roles must adopt a risk-based, compliance-first approach. When faced with a request that could impact data privacy, the decision-making process should involve 1. Understanding the data. What specific personal data is involved? 2. Understanding the purpose. Why is this data being processed and by whom? 3. Identifying legal basis. Is there a valid legal basis for this processing, e.g., consent, legitimate interest, contractual necessity? 4. Assessing consent. If consent is the basis, is it explicit, informed, freely given, and specific to the intended use? 5. Evaluating risks. What are the potential privacy risks, security risks, and reputational risks? 6. Consulting regulations, referencing relevant data protection laws and guidelines. 7. Proposing compliant solutions, identifying ways to achieve business objectives while respecting privacy. 8. Documenting decisions, keeping a record of the assessment and the rationale for any decision. 9. Escalating appropriately. If a compliant solution cannot be found, clearly articulating the risks and noncompliance to stakeholders and management. Question 19. Strategic planning requires administrators to anticipate and address potential conflicts between business objectives and data protection mandates. If senior management directs an administrator to bypass a critical Symantec data loss prevention policy to expedite a new product launch, what is the most responsible course of action? Option A. Implement the directive but attempt to manually monitor data flow for suspicious activity to compensate for the bypass policy. Option B. Report the directive to the relevant external regulatory authority, citing potential data privacy violations. Option C. Immediately implement the directive to meet the launch deadline, while making a note in the system logs to track the deviation. Option D. Refuse to implement the directive and inform senior management that it violates company policy and potentially legal regulations, proposing alternative compliance solutions. The correct answer is C. Immediately implement the directive to meet the launch deadline, while making a note in the system logs to track the deviation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common ethical dilemma in data security administration, specifically concerning the balance between an organization's need for operational efficiency and its legal and ethical obligations to protect sensitive customer data. The administrator is caught between a directive from senior management, which may prioritize business objectives over strict adherence to data protection protocols, and their professional responsibility to uphold those protocols. The challenge lies in navigating this conflict without compromising data integrity, violating regulatory requirements, or jeopardizing the trust placed in them by both the organization and its customers. The pressure to comply with a potentially risky directive, coupled with the potential consequences of non-compliance or of raising concerns, makes careful judgment and a strong ethical compass essential. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves prioritizing regulatory compliance and data protection principles over the immediate directive. This means clearly articulating the potential risks and regulatory violations associated with the proposed shortcut to senior management. It requires referencing specific Symantec data loss prevention, DLP, policies and relevant regulatory frameworks, e.g. If the exam implies U.S. jurisdiction, this would involve HIPAA, CCPA, or similar data privacy laws that prohibit or restrict the proposed action. The administrator should propose alternative solutions that achieve the business objective without compromising security, such as a phased rollout, enhanced monitoring, or a temporary exception process with strict oversight. This approach upholds professional integrity, ensures legal compliance, and protects the organization from significant fines and reputational damage. It demonstrates a commitment to responsible data stewardship, which is a cornerstone of effective DLP administration. Incorrect approaches analysis. Implementing the directive without question or further investigation represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It directly violates the principles of data protection and could lead to breaches of sensitive information, resulting in severe penalties under relevant data privacy laws. This approach demonstrates a lack of professional judgment and a failure to uphold the administrator's duty of care. Attempting to implement the directive while subtly trying to mitigate risks without explicit approval or communication to management is also professionally unacceptable. This shadow IT or rogue administrator approach undermines transparency and accountability. It bypasses established change management processes and could lead to unforeseen consequences or conflicts with other security controls. Furthermore, it fails to adequately address the root regulatory concerns and leaves the organization exposed if the mitigation efforts are insufficient or overlooked. Escalating the issue immediately to external regulatory bodies without first attempting to resolve it internally through proper channels is generally not the best professional practice. While whistleblowing is a last resort, bypassing internal reporting structures can be seen as unprofessional and can damage internal relationships, potentially hindering future compliance efforts. The primary responsibility is to address the issue within the organization first, using established procedures for reporting and resolving compliance concerns. Professional reasoning. Professionals in data security administration must adopt a decision-making process that prioritizes ethical conduct and regulatory compliance. This involves 1. Understanding the directive, thoroughly analyze the request and its implications. 2. Identifying risks and violations, assess potential data breaches, privacy violations, and non-compliance with specific regulations and organizational policies. 3. Consulting policies and regulations. Refer to the Symantec DLP documentation, internal security policies, and applicable legal frameworks. 4. Communicating concerns. Clearly and professionally articulate risks and potential violations to the requesting party and relevant stakeholders, providing evidence. 5. Proposing alternatives. Suggest compliant and secure solutions that meet business needs. 6. Documenting decisions. Maintain a clear record of the directive, the analysis, the communication, and the final decision. 7. Escalating appropriately. If internal resolution fails, follow established escalation paths within the organization and consider external reporting only as a last resort after exhausting internal options. Question 20. Research into Symantec data loss prevention 15 administration has revealed a critical alert indicating a potential exfiltration of sensitive customer financial data by an employee. The alert is based on a policy designed to detect the unauthorized transfer of personally identifiable information, PI, and financial account numbers. The administrator has confirmed the alert's validity, but notes that there is no explicit company policy detailing the exact procedure for handling such specific data exfiltration alerts, though a general IT acceptable use policy exists. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the DLP administrator? Option A. Directly confront the employee in question, demanding an explanation for the alert and their actions. Option B. Ignore the alert, as there is no specific policy in place to address this exact scenario, and proceed with routine system maintenance. Option C. Immediately consult with the organization's legal and human resources departments to review the alert, assess the situation against existing policies and relevant U.S. data protection laws, and determine the appropriate investigative and response protocols. Option D. Escalate the incident directly to local law enforcement agencies for immediate investigation, providing them with all available alert data. The correct answer is C. Immediately consult with the organization's legal and human resources departments to review the alert, assess the situation against existing policies and relevant U.S. data protection laws, and determine the appropriate investigative and response protocols. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between an organization's need to protect sensitive data and the potential for overreach or misuse of monitoring capabilities. The administrator must navigate the ethical implications of data monitoring while adhering to Symantec data loss prevention, DLP 15's administrative responsibilities, and the implied regulatory framework governing data privacy and security within the United States. The core challenge lies in balancing security imperatives with employee privacy rights and organizational policy. The correct approach represents best professional practice, because it prioritizes a transparent and policy-driven response. By consulting with the legal and HR departments, the administrator ensures that any action taken aligns with established company policies, U.S. federal and state privacy laws, such as HIPAA for healthcare data, GLBA for financial data, or general data breach notification laws, and ethical considerations. This collaborative approach mitigates legal risks, upholds employee trust, and ensures that the DLP system is used as an authorized tool for compliance and security, not for unwarranted surveillance. It demonstrates a commitment to due process and responsible data management. An incorrect approach that involves immediately escalating the incident to law enforcement without internal review fails to respect internal policies and employee rights. This could lead to unnecessary legal entanglements for the organization and damage employee morale. It bypasses the established channels for addressing potential policy violations or security breaches, which typically involve internal investigation and disciplinary procedures before external reporting. Another incorrect approach, which is to ignore the alert due to a lack of explicit policy, is professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates negligence and a failure to uphold the administrator's responsibility to manage and respond to security alerts generated by the DLP system. Ignoring potential data exfiltration or policy violations leaves the organization vulnerable to significant financial penalties, reputational damage, and legal liabilities under various U.S. data protection regulations. It also undermines the purpose of implementing a DLP solution. A third incorrect approach, which is to directly confront the employee and demand an explanation, is also professionally unsound. This bypasses established HR and legal protocols, potentially creating a hostile work environment and jeopardizing any subsequent formal investigation. It can also lead to the destruction of evidence or the employee becoming uncooperative, hindering the organization's ability to properly assess and address the situation. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Acknowledge and document the alert. 2. Assess the severity and potential impact of the alert based on the data type and context. 3. Consult internal policies and relevant U.S. regulations to understand reporting and handling requirements. 4. Engage appropriate internal stakeholders such as legal, HR, and information security leadership to determine the next steps. 5. Follow established procedures for investigation, remediation, and, if necessary, reporting. 6. Maintain clear and objective documentation throughout the process.